does Netflix work thing, and I thought about, well, what is the future of people getting entertainment, or the past of people getting entertainment at home? And the first kind of home entertainment device was one of these things. And it was kind of expensive, in the early 20th century, people might have had some. The records were kind of fragile and they broke easily. But that was kind of the first recorded information home entertainment device. And then, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, radio started to be a thing in people's homes, and it was the first kind of mass media device where people could kind of gather around and be entertained by things that their neighbors and friends were hearing at the same time. And then by the time you get into the 50s, late 40s, 50s, 60s, you had broadcast television that everybody was watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show or whatever. And then 80s and 90s, the dreaded cable TV came along, and the cable TV died. And so what I think of Netflix as doing is inventing internet TV. So I've been around Netflix since 2003, so before we were delivering content over networks. And when we first started delivering content over networks, nobody was doing this. YouTube had just started. It was very short form, user-generated content, but as we were having these discussions internally about delivering, kind of what we thought about as DVD quality content at the time, in real time, over the internet, it was a fairly crazy thing to think about doing. And, no one had yet invented kind of adaptive streaming algorithms that would help you figure out how much network capacity you had and how good an image you could show to people. And so we kind of had to make all that up as we went along. And then the part of it that I'm responsible for is really getting that content, to the person at home or on a mobile network, wherever they are, across the network and to that device. And so we end up building this purpose-built Netflix content delivery network called OpenConnect, which is currently serving more than 125 million hours of content a day. So, everybody's here to kind of, we focused around today the launch of Daredevil Season 2, and so I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about, like, how does that content get out there across the globe, and kind of how does all that work? And so one of the things that we were quite conscious of when we were designing this system is to use as little of the kind of internet backbone capacity as possible. So essentially, we want to get a file into a region or a locality once, and then be able to show that file to people thousands or millions of times. So I used Australia as an example here, just because it's kind of obviously quite contained. The only way you can get content on or off of Australia is across undersea cables. Undersea cable capacity is the most expensive element of the global internet. And so in this example, we created this nice, pristine piece of content. It's the entire season of Daredevil Season 2. We transcode that content into a number of different file formats and a number of different bit rates. And now we've got the files that we actually want to show to people. And so those files would be copied once. That the server in Australia, actually one of the servers would have gone and fetched that from the Amazon cloud where we do our transcoding. And then that server would then signal that it's got the content, and other servers in that region would fetch that content from that server. And so essentially, we've used this expensive component of the internet only once for each file, which is essentially the equivalent of one person viewing that file.
So you take the content from one server and fetch it in the country itself to multiple ones.
Exactly. And the whole purpose there is to keep traffic as local as possible. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we do this during off-peak periods. So networks are built for peak period capacity, and if you're careful about only moving content around in the middle of the night, then basically you're moving content around at a time when the network is essentially free. It's unloaded, and we do this by a typical commercial CDN does what's called opportunistic caching. So they see that somebody has requested this image, 5 times, and they decide, oh, it's a popular image, I should cache that and start serving it from cache. We have a bit of a different opportunity with Netflix in that the folks who access our content are our members, and we have a specific library of content that's available. And so we can look at the utilization patterns of that content and decide which piece of content should be on which server, and then, as I said, put it there in the middle of the night when the network's not being used. And so this is really how we deliver the vast majority of our content around the world. So in 90% of the cases, we're directly connected to the network that our end user is using to access the internet. So one simple model of how that works is we have a bunch of those servers in a big internet exchange facility somewhere. So for instance, when we launched globally, before we did that, we set up a bunch of capacity in Dubai, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Johannesburg, so that we can reach that region and then directly connect to the ISP networks, who then delivered across their customer networks to people's residences. The other thing we do is we provide these Open Connect appliances for free to ISPs. So an ISP who's seeing some Netflix traffic on their network can actually go to our website, fill out a form, and say, hey, I would like to use one of your caches to be more efficient in the delivery, and to, so I don't need to be hauling that traffic from anywhere farther upstream in my network. And we provide those caches for free. And so in that kind of model, we're actually in usually the data center that's kind of closest to the people who are actually consuming the content. So if you're at home and you're using a fixed line network, there's some piece of twisted pair copper or coaxial copper or fiber that's going from your house to some location, which is the first kind of entry point to that ISP's network. And in a perfect world, the ISP has deployed servers to that segment of the network, and then none of this upstream capacity is required for Netflix. Because again, getting that file, that new copy of Daredevil season 1 or 2 is something we only need to do once, and then serve it from that server over and over again. And so we created essentially custom servers because we don't have it's not a typical use case. So typically when people are buying servers from a Dell or a HP, they're either looking for very kind of compute intensive servers, or they're looking for storage appliances. We had this need to create a lot of storage and a lot of network capacity at the same time. And so we ended up designing this system essentially so that we could put as many hard drives as possible, as high a capacity hard drives as possible inside it. And so I think our current system has about 175 terabytes of storage in it. And then essentially read files off those disks and onto the network as quickly as possible. So in my team is some hardware engineers that work with people who build systems and design these things to get the right airflow and to be compliant with the things that they need to be compliant with to go into ISP data centers. And then we also have a whole team of operating system folks, so folks that work on the FreeBSD kernel to kind of really tune the capacity of these. So the first one of these boxes that we put out could do almost 10 gigabits a second from a single box. The current boxes that we have can do almost 100 gigabits a second from a single box.
And you didn't call out the quote.
Oh,
There is a story
Amazing
behind them,
quote.
I'm guessing.
Yes, we
Every box has a quote on it.
yeah.
From
So
the movie.
we have a spreadsheet, like a Google Doc spreadsheet, that the whole team goes in, and their favorite movie quotes they could just put on the spreadsheet, and then we have somebody who like puts those movie quotes on there. So that's a Big
guys know
Big
which movie it's from?
Lebowski.
Big Lebowski.
Yeah, that's
I just sent in my quote.
that's a team
American
favorite.
Gangster.
Yeah. So Anne Marie's new quote.
I didn't
will
know
end
there
up
was
on
a
the
Say
list.
what one.
I
There's a
would have been
list.
participating.
So why do we do this? It's as we said, it's less expensive for ISPs. So we, if you think about it, an ISP is in the business of providing a great internet experience to their subscribers. If you use the Netflix U.S. as an example, where Netflix has been operating for a while now, Netflix is up to 37% of downstream capacity on the internet in a given evening. And so our job then is to make that as inexpensive as possible. So essentially bring that portion of the internet that's Netflix into that ISP's data center and remove the need for that ISP to provide the interconnection capacity to deliver that content. It also creates better quality. So if you're getting that server as close as possible to the end user, then the chance that there's some congestion in between you and that server is much less. The chance that your viewing is interrupted is much less. The chance that you can serve the highest quality file is much greater. And I also think an important part of the role of Netflix and my team in general is to, I think of it as good internet stewardship. So again, if you were going to design the internet as an academic exercise, one of the things you do is you'd say, I want the largest data flows to originate the closest to the end users, because I don't want to use the central parts of the system for large data flows. I want those large data flows close to the end users. And so we have the opportunity to do that and create good scale on the internet. And there's lots of places. There was a gentleman from Brazil here earlier, and we had quite a discussion on how, when we originally launched in Brazil, most of our traffic was coming from the US, but over a relatively short period of time, a couple years, we worked with all of the major internet providers in Brazil to get traffic into the country of Brazil. Originally 80 or 90% of that was coming from Sao Paulo, which is where most of the interconnectivity is, but then over time, to get that farther and farther out to the edge. So now we have servers, in the rainforest of Brazil and fairly remote locations along the coast. And again, because every once in a while you'll hear some article about somebody saying, oh my gosh, it's going to break the internet, or the internet is not going to scale, or there's no way that we could serve all the content we serve on linear TV, over the top. But that's actually a fallacy, because that's thinking from a perspective of all this content would come from one location and have to use the long haul capacity of the internet. If the content is actually coming from inside the last mile network, that kind of scaling is not an issue. So as I said, one of the ways to think about why this is important is it would actually be impossible, given the capacity of the global internet, for us to serve our traffic from a single location. So Telegeography is a company that does research on kind of the total international capacity of the internet, the capacity of the kind of fiber backbone, country-to-country fiber backbone. That's about 35 terabits right now. Netflix traffic is actually greater than that. And so that's, again, why the necessity for localization is so great. And we just see this as our mission to, kind of keep doing this as we expand around the globe. So I mentioned, before we turned on 130 additional countries in January, we went out to these locations where there's very dense internet and connectivity. We talked to all the major network providers about what's the most efficient way to interconnect with us, and we do that very proactively, so that we can be as efficient as possible. Just another way to illustrate this is, if you think about, this is a network provider, a large network provider has many kind of local locations, many different metro areas. Those usually go back to regional aggregation facilities and then are connected to their internet backbone. So one of the things that we try and do is have as much of our traffic as possible originate from these local servers so that they don't need to build additional fiber capacity here, they don't need to build additional router capacity here, and it essentially saves a tremendous amount of capacity build out on the internet. So one of the folks on my team put this together. I'm going to start it in a second. It's a kind of piece of animation. I just wanted to give you a flavor of kind of how this network has grown over the past few years. So we originally started in 2012. I don't have data in the right format to go all the way back to 2012. So this starts in March of 2014. And what you'll see is these little green dots and yellow dots start to appear. And the green dots represent where we have servers inside ISP networks, and the yellow dots represent where we have servers in these big internet exchange facilities. But I just thought it was kind of fun to give you, you'll be able to see how, I don't need the music, I don't think, how this network has kind of grown around the world. You know, the fun thing for me is to think about, like, we have, you know, if you look way up north in Tromsø, Norway, that's like way above the Arctic Circle. We have a server in the Faroe Islands. We have a server in Greenland. We have, you know, as far south as, I was putting this up in the blog because I thought, like Hobart, Tasmania, Puerto Montt, Chile. We have a server in Malta, one on Guam, multiple on Guam. So it's really been interesting. And then, as I said, these are the big 4 places of interconnection within the new global regions that we're reaching. And then, as I was talking about earlier, as ISPs start to see Netflix traffic show up on their network, they can literally just go onto our website, fill out a form, we'll call them up, talk about their network topology, and then just start shipping them these servers for free.
So the green are the local ones? And
Yeah, the green are inside ISPs. The yellow are the big internet exchange centers where everybody kind of interconnects. And the height of the yellow column is essentially the capacity of that location.
So basically,
so like
right.
Chicago is the biggest capacity in the US.
So right now you don't have any in India.
Right now we don't have any in India,
Yeah.
but we are definitely actively working with multiple ISPs, and we have active relationships with several ISPs in India. But usually what happens is, you know, so if India was already a big Netflix market, then there would probably already be servers there. But what happens is you don't want to put the server in before you really need it. And so, you know, again, we started working with folks quite some time ago when we knew we were coming to those regions to let people know how this would work and to provide this as an opportunity. And then what happens is you want to install a server at the point where you're going to serve more traffic from that server than it's going to take to keep it full, you know, or to keep the content current. So that's all I had. This is my favorite question slide that I found. Yes.
Okay. So India may have decent enough broadband at home, even
Yes.
at the lowest rate, to get Netflix running.
Yes.
But on mobile, it's still very, very poor, the network
Yes.
connectivity.
Mhm.
We've seen some local players in India that provide movie content, offer offline playback.
Yes.
So you could, have the movie stored locally on your phone if you downloaded
Yeah.
it at home and watch it on the go. Is Netflix planning anything similar?
So traditionally, what's happened is we've seen the networks grow so quickly that didn't make sense. But we're always looking at ways to improve the product. So I wouldn't rule that out, but there's no current.
Just to add,
Yeah.
most of us got off 16-hour flights.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would be awesome if we could have some way of caching stuff on our mobile
yeah.
devices, which would allow us to watch stuff that
Yeah.
we wouldn't want to watch on the airplane.
Yeah, it's really interesting to us because maybe this is too much of a diversion, but I'll tell a bit of a story that kind of relates to it. So when we first started developing this service, we actually were thinking about, because in the United States it was a DVD shipping model, and you had a queue of what DVDs you wanted us to ship you, in a ranked order of movies. And when we first started thinking about how this would work in 2005, I think was the we were actually thinking, this will download overnight. stuff that's in your queue, and we'll play it back later. And what happened is we all started doing these spreadsheets of what does our connectivity look like at home. And the connectivity grew essentially along a Moore's law curve. And so we decided at the time in the US that by the time we get this product out, we would be able to essentially show at least DVD quality in real time over the internet. And so our bet since the beginning has been that networks, there's so much demand for network capacity that networks just grow. It's still been we've actually, there are a couple of airlines that have, that Netflix works with.
Go Entertainment.
Yeah, and, we're kind of in constant discussion with those folks because in reality, the satellite capacity exists to play Netflix just fine in real time. So again, we'll see how all this evolves, but that's been our bet so far. I think, obviously we will learn a lot more. We just launched in India. India is a giant market. We're acutely aware that there is a bunch of stuff we need to learn to be smart about how that market works and how we need to evolve over time.
Speaking of when you were talking about the way data moves, you've actually recently shifted to Amazon completely, right? With
So I think we unintentionally kind of create some confusion around this. The easiest way to think about it is Amazon, the servers that we run in Amazon is everything before you hit play.
Okay.
And this Open Connect network is everything after you hit play.
Okay.
So like the user interface.
Right. Amazon is great for kind of generic, you have a bunch of microservices that run in Java and you want a bunch, extendable compute capacity for those services. And so as Amory said, the stuff that keeps track of your customer records, the stuff that authenticates you, the stuff that does the algorithms to decide what kind of content we should be displaying to you, the stuff that does the transcoding, taking the master file and transcoding it. That's all stuff that requires extensible computing, and that Amazon's a great solution for that. So we still had some stuff sitting around in data centers that did some of that. We got done with this migration to Amazon that we thought was going to take a couple years and ended up taking quite a bit longer. So that's that part of it. This part of it, again, the job is not just a compute job or just a network job. It's really a job of getting that content local. And so that's not a service we could buy. We actually used to use third-party CDNs to do this, but we realized at a certain point that given our scale, we were kind of outsized in that market. And because of our ability to pre-position content, we could actually do it much more efficiently than.
Can I heard you say that the Amazon stuff is all about tapping the computing power for them, and what we're talking about with Open Connect is really about storage, right?
Well, it's about storage, the combination of storage and network and the right locality, which is, it's a need that Netflix has.
So we don't use Amazon for Open Connect.
Okay.
Just coming back to Amazon, so if Amazon is about compute performance, why Amazon? Why not Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud?
Because when we started this migration, which I guess was 2009, we looked at Azure in the early days, and it really didn't have near the level of sophistication in terms of the interfaces that Amazon provided and the additional services that Amazon provided, and Google didn't even have an offering at that time. And so it's still the case that I think Amazon is quite a bit ahead of the rest of the market, but it's something that we'll keep looking at over time.
So regarding the Middle East
Mhm.
market
Yep.
and the ISPs over there,
Mhm.
what's your planning over there? Should they? I saw something in Dubai.
Yep.
I think.
Yeah, so
But in the biggest market there is Saudi Arabia, I
Right.
think. And
right, but what you'll find is all of the major Middle Eastern networks have interconnectivity in Dubai. So that's the easiest place to start, because if you think about it, you're a network in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a network in Kuwait. You have to get the network that your users are attached to the rest of the internet. And so the first place that typically happens is Dubai for the Middle East. And so that's an easy place to get started, and it's easy for us to deploy capacity there, to build capacity. Then what happens is, so we have what we call a partner engagement manager on our team, and his whole job is, and one that's focused specifically on the Middle East. So his whole job is to talk to these networks in the Middle East. In most cases, we're kind of already connected to those networks, but then how do we scale? And when does it make sense to add servers? And so really that becomes this joint engineering exercise between us and those networks in most cases.
Coming back to all those nodes in that globe, all those are Netflix nodes and not Amazon nodes, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so think about, again, the easiest way to think about it is before you hit play, your client is interacting with Amazon. When you hit play, then you basically, we're going to assign that play to a server that's near you. And so that's all what we call Open Connect. It's our own custom hardware, our own custom operating system. It's
So if there's ever an outage or a problem on the Amazon level, would that affect the consumer directly while trying to consume content?
So there's a couple answers to that question. First answer is, it would have to be a pretty catastrophic Amazon problem because we operate in 3 different Amazon regions around the world. So we operate West Coast of the U.S., East Coast of the U.S., and Europe. And we have failover capacity between all of those. And so they'd all have to have a problem for it to really interrupt service. Again, once you've pressed play, you're kind of handed off to the Open Connect network, and so your stream wouldn't be interrupted if you're playing. But if Amazon was totally down, people couldn't start a new stream.
No.
But one of the good things is, like say your local network, lost, because, the Amazon compute is very centralized in just those 3 locations. Our network is distributed all over the world. And so if you happen to have a transient issue of connecting to Amazon, it wouldn't interrupt your playback because it's a different component.
So the catalog, all the sort of the UI stuff before the stream actually starts is what sits on Amazon.
Yes.
So okay.
With the exception of the images,
Are you
right?
gonna start drawing?
Yeah. No, I don't know.
About to get
Yeah. No.
She loves to draw.
But yeah, it's the
Where do the images get served off?
the images get served off Open Connect.
Oh, okay.
When you were launching globally, international markets, I mean, Dubai and Singapore were still not there, right? But you already have Open Connect in Dubai and Singapore and not in India, which is a much bigger market.
Interestingly, the way, and again, I will confess to being still in the very early naive days about how ultimately all of the stuff that we need to learn about India, and I several of my team have spent some time in India, and I would like to get there this year as well. And start to learn more and more. But one of the reasons for Singapore is most of the major networks in India are well interconnected. Singapore is one of the central internet hubs for that region.
So the content for India is coming from, it's connecting to Singapore.
That's correct.
And in the Middle East, in Dubai,
That's correct.
and other places.
Majorly
in
undersea
Europe,
cables
or
come
only-
by.
The vast majority of Middle East would be coming from Dubai right now. It may be the case that there are Middle East networks that prefer to use some of their interconnection capacity in large internet exchanges in Europe, and in that case we would do that as well.
Purely based on latency and stuff like that.
It's really, it's interesting from our perspective. What we want to do is do what is the right thing for that ISP. So, rather than just saying, look, we'll decide how to serve this traffic, we make those decisions based on the routes that ISPs are advertising to us. So we really think of the ISP as being in control of where that traffic should come from.
Okay. Do you want to shed some light about sort of the adaptive sort of streaming that you do? Because I mean, I think we've already mentioned that we've seen it work pretty well on fairly bad connections.
Yes.
I mean, fairly bad by US standards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody want water?
And probably how it's kind of comparatively different to say a YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I mentioned earlier that when we first started doing this, that there was no adaptive streaming. We had to kind of make it up. And and when we first did it, it was kind of primitive. It was like, we should try and do a throughput test, and then based on that throughput test, we should figure out which file to serve. And then we pretty quickly realized that, well, we should be getting a file instead of just doing a few throughput tests, so that we can start showing you something, and then doing a better job figuring out, whether we're showing you the right file, or whether we should be showing you a better file or a slightly lower resolution file. And so I think the short answer is YouTube tends to have less granularity. It's kind of, here's a 360, here's a 720, here's a 1080 or something like that. And we'll have 7 or 9 different bit rates that are available. So if you think about it, you've pressed play, whatever your client is, if it's a PC or a Roku or whatever the device is, it's now buffering that data into its video buffer, and it's going to start playing it back. And so essentially we're trying to serve the highest quality image that matches how quickly we're getting data from the network and how quickly it's going to play out of that video buffer. And so I think we do a good job on all kinds of networks, because we've had a ton of practice at it. So if you think about 125 million hours a day of content, that represents that represents a tremendous amount of data points that we can then analyze and see, where are we doing a good job, where are we doing a bad job. Our job is essentially to never rebuffer, right? And so as long as you have some amount of capacity that's greater than the lowest bitrate file that we have, we should be adapting to that amount of throughput and never interrupting your experience. I think of it's better to show you a slightly less quality image than you're in the middle of this story and you're absorbed in it, and then I'm going to stop, right? And so we really think a lot about that stuff. We have this is why I kind of started the presentation with inventing internet TV. I think that's the really magic thing that we try and spend a lot of time on, is how to do a great job on a vast variety of network conditions.
An average movie on Netflix or show, I don't know exactly, takes up around about 3 GB of data.
For a 1080p stream.
Yeah, for a 1080p stream.
Per hour.
Yeah. So how does that work out in a market in like India? Because we have limited data caps even on broadband connections. Say the connection I have at home has a maximum limit of 265 GB in a month, and it's a 8 Mbps connection.
Yep.
And ever since I've started using Netflix, I've been wiping that out within 15 to 20 days.
Okay, so it's not unusual that you wouldn't know this, because it's kind of in the configuration of, but you actually can go into your account.
Yeah.
And we have a kind of good, better, best.
Yeah, I know that,
slider, right?
but generally, how would you tackle that kind of a issue? How would you communicate that better? Because that is sort of hidden inside the interface, and for the general user, we guys would be probably power users out here. So how would you communicate that? How would that work out in a market like India?
Just to add on to his point, for the general user, the communication will come via a nasty shock that his
data cap is
low.
So this is an interesting question, especially on fixed line networks. So I
it's
again,
worse on mobile. So
it's worse on mobile. On mobile, we don't tend to try and serve as high a stream, right? Because there's no sense in trying to give you, a 3 megabit per second stream on your cell phone in most cases, because you don't need that. So mobile, the data utilization tends to be much less anyway. Our default is a much lower bit rate, and so it's not that it's impossible that you'll run into data caps, but it's less likely. In general, we think data caps are a really bad way to manage networks. Because really, if you think about it, networks are always built to peak capacity. And so peak capacity has nothing to do with how many bytes you transfer. In the middle of the night, if you transfer bytes, that is essentially free to the network. At the most peak period of utilization, that's expensive to the network. So it's not the right model. And again, I would confess we're still trying to learn in India, and it may be that we need to do, it may well be that we need to do more to message users and to make sure that nobody is shocked, to your point.
Actually, I have a suggestion for that.
Yes.
I was trying out 4G connection on my phone, streaming Netflix, and using Opera Max. And I could actually save almost 45% of data from what they are showing without any discernible difference in quality of streaming. So why don't you have something like that built in for
I'm not familiar with the product.
okay, the Opera Max it's a
That browser.
it's a third. I mean, from Opera they have a product wherein they I think they do the compression of the video on their side, and then the overall consumption will be almost like 40 to 50.
Their prop.
Opera Max doesn't do compression. They automatically switch your bitrate down.
Yeah, they're probably kind of getting in between and telling us to serve you a lower bit, right?
Yeah, that's exactly
Probably,
what.
but there is no discernible difference in quality from what I before using and after using.
Yeah.
I couldn't
I know
Google
because I
does
used to service Opera, so I know exactly. This is exactly what they do. They
Yep.
tell Netflix, or they even do this for YouTube.
Yeah.
Apple
They
Music,
they
lot of
tell
stuff.
they tell the service to serve a lower bitrate.
So I think so. Essentially, we could do that same thing, and I think probably it seems to me likely. And again, I'm just the headline is we've got a lot to learn, and we intend to learn it. But I think it's quite likely that we may need to do more to message users that you have the ability to turn down your bitrate utilization to turn it up. The one example I was going to give on the fixed line side is when we initially launched in Canada, Canadian networks had relatively low bitrate caps. And again, with fixed line networks, in many cases, that's just not necessary. It's just a business model that had developed. But originally, we launched in Canada where we kept our bit rates quite low. And then over time, based on a lot of feedback from consumers in Canada and regulators in Canada, we decided, that's probably not. And what happened is other networks, some of the Canadian networks started saying, we don't need to do this. We can provide an unlimited service. And so we started uncapping Netflix. And in the end, most of the Canadian providers now have very high data caps that most people never run into. So again, it's a lot of this stuff is to do with the evolution of how networks grow over time, but definitely true that it's different conditions in different markets. And so again, I keep saying it, but like the highlight for me is we've got a lot to learn about that market, and we want to be very, very kind of kind and responsive to our members.
At the same time, are you looking at some partnerships with the ISPs so that Netflix can be served as an unlimited service, so that the user doesn't have to worry how much data is being consumed?
Yeah, so we've had a position globally that we don't pay for that kind of zero rating. We don't like zero rating programs that favor one kind of provider over another, because even though that can kind of short-term seem good for consumers, I think it's bad for the general evolution of the internet. So to the extent that a provider would make a program that any video provider could use and that people didn't have to pay for, we would certainly consider participating in that program. But we really stay away from programs and have publicly stated that we stay away from programs where we would pay a fee and get zero rated for that. Because again, I think what happens then is the network providers pick the winners and losers, and I don't think that's the way the internet should evolve.
My question is regarding the VPN.
Sorry. Because zero rating is a huge thing in India.
Yeah, I am
totally applauded to that. That's why I was laughing.
It's good.
Yeah.
We guys have just gone through the pre-basics thing.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
I may have read a bit about that. You were going to say?
Regarding the VPN networks and the people accessing the other services or servers from other countries, what's your approach on this?
It's a very tough one for us, to tell you the truth. We would love to have global access to all of our content everywhere, and that's certainly what we work on doing. So our content teams are out there every day trying to negotiate global rights to every piece of content that we have rights to. But since, essentially if you think about how entertainment grew around the world, back to the kind of history thing, it started with movie theaters, and each piece of content was licensed for a particular country for a particular period of time. And so really, we're dealing with the evolution of that kind of content licensing. And so, like I said, our strong preference would be we have global rights to everything, and nobody ever has to worry about this stuff because there's no difference in the catalogs. And if you look at it, one of the things that we found is the perception of difference in catalogs is actually greater. In the vast majority of cases, most of our originals, most of our great content is available to people at most locations. Having said that, sometimes we get pressure from rights holders that, hey, people are using these VPNs, and we have to do what we, kind of are required to do contractually to try and respond to those.
But it's not actually banning them from using the service. It's like just
no, not at all. It's just saying that in our content licensing agreements require us to only show you content that we're authorized to show in that particular region.
But what are you doing to block VPNs? There was a blog post where you guys said that you guys are going to do more to block VPNs, especially after you went live in 130 countries.
Yeah, it's basically just trying to comply with kind of industry standard practices around geolocation, proper geolocation.
Okay. So there's nothing extraordinary, there's no new technology that Netflix is developing to sort of counter that kind of problem?
I guess the best answer for that is the ball for industry standard moves. Particularly with us, because we are the largest global service, we've found over time that there was kind of more and more of an industry around creating solutions to kind of get around Netflix geo restrictions. So essentially, we're just doing some stuff to kind of respond to people trying to get more creative. Yeah, I'll tell you,
We know it's frustrating.
Yeah, we know it's frustrating, and from our standpoint, we see our job is just to, do our best to fix global licensing so that people don't have to worry about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's true with our originals, but it's also true with the content that we've been licensing. Increasingly, we're negotiating global licenses with the various studios. So shows like How to Get Away with Murder and things like that, we negotiated for global licenses. But this is a relatively new phenomena in the content industry, the idea of a global license, and we're the only ones doing it. So you can imagine there's a learning curve there before they get used to this kind of a negotiation. But that's our goal, ultimately, to have all these catalogs look as similar as possible.
So we can't see like HBO content and other networks in Netflix.
You would never see, I won't say never, but it would be very hard to see HBO. They're a direct competitor. But more of the shows that we're licensing, so from ABC or Disney, ABC Network or NBC Universal, or even the international shows that we license and movies, we will increasingly ask for the global rights to it. And if we can't get the global rights, we probably won't take the show, because the idea is to have the catalogs be as similar as possible.
Let me sort of rephrase that. Say, we all know Game of Thrones is supremely popular, and it's a HBO show.
Yeah.
So, say if you get an opportunity to have a local license for Game of Thrones, you'll probably not take it because you can't get the global license for it.
Probably not.
Even if it's Game of Thrones.
I won't speak for our content officer, Ted Sarandos, but for us, the overall, I think the HBO example is not a good one, because it's HBO, right? And they're not going to license their content to us. If you took a different network, the answer would still be the same. Our focus is really on the global rights, so that your content is the same as his content, is the same as our content, and really there's more similarities than dissimilarities.
Is this something that you have taken up now that you have almost 180 countries, or is it something that you had before?
We started doing it about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. So we started doing it before the global launch, but obviously we knew that we were going to be global. And we knew that that was an issue that we wanted to try to address.
If you imagine the way these studio systems have evolved and such. There are regional distributors there, and that there's whole organizational structures around the regional. And so if we show up and we say we want global rights, people didn't even know what that was, when we first started talking about it. And so I think we have made a tremendous amount of progress so far. We certainly think there's a lot of progress to be made as well.